The country that should not exist. Imagine a country that, by every law of nature, should be underwater. A place where millions of people live several meters below sea level. A nation whose largest international airport was built on the floor of a drained lake. A country where powerful pumps work every hour of every day, moving enormous amounts of water back into the sea. If those pumps stopped, the sea would begin reclaiming the land within days. And yet, despite this impossible geography, nearly 18 million people live here. Thriving cities stand where waves once crashed. Vast fields stretch across land that was once part of the ocean. One of Europe's strongest economies flourishes on territory that nature never intended to be dry. This is the Netherlands. For more than 1,000 years, the Dutch have fought a war unlike any other in history, not against invading armies or rival kingdoms, but against the sea itself. It is a war that has shaped every generation, every city, every village, and even the national character of the Dutch people. In this documentary, we'll discover how an entire nation was literally built by human hands. We'll explore the world's most advanced flood protection system, witness one of Europe's deadliest natural disasters, uncover engineering marvels unlike anything else on Earth, separate famous myths from historical reality, and learn why, after centuries of reclaiming land from the sea, the Dutch have recently begun giving some of it back. Because the greatest lesson the Netherlands has learned is that sometimes victory doesn't come from defeating nature but from learning how to live with it. Across Europe, an old saying has survived for centuries. God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. At first, it sounds like national pride. But once you understand the country's history, it begins to sound surprisingly close to the truth. To understand why, we have to travel back thousands of years. Long before Amsterdam existed. Long before windmills turned across the countryside. Long before enormous dams protected millions of people. This landscape looked completely different. The name Netherlands literally means Low Countries, and that isn't just poetic. It is a remarkably accurate description. The country sits in one of the largest river deltas on Earth, where several great European rivers including the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt finally empty into the North Sea. For thousands of years these rivers carried enormous quantities of sand, clay, and fertile silt from deep inside Europe. At the same time, coastal marshes slowly accumulated thick layers of peat as plants died and decomposed in waterlogged soil. The result was a vast landscape unlike almost anywhere else. Flat, soft, waterlogged, barely rising above sea level. Twice every day the tides pushed seawater inland. Storms regularly flooded enormous areas. Rivers frequently overflowed. Much of the region resembled a giant swamp, dotted with shallow lakes, winding channels, mud flats, and reed-covered marshes. To outsiders, it looked almost impossible to inhabit. When Roman soldiers reached these northern lands nearly 2,000 years ago, they struggled to understand how anyone could survive here. Roman historian Pliny the Elder described the local inhabitants as people living on small hills, in the middle of the water. To Roman eyes, they seemed trapped between land and sea. During high tide, their homes appeared to float like islands. During low tide, they walked across muddy flats searching for fish, shellfish, and anything useful carried in by the sea. Firewood was scarce. Stone was almost non-existent. Agriculture was difficult. Floods were constant. Most civilizations would have abandoned such a place. The people living here chose a different solution. Instead of escaping the water, they learned to rise above it. Their first great invention was astonishingly simple. If the sea couldn't be stopped, then homes had to stand higher than the floods. Using nothing but baskets, wooden shovels, and endless human labor, entire communities began building artificial hills. Basket after basket, layer after layer, generation after generation. These man-made mounds became known as turpen. Some reached several meters in height. Entire villages including farms, churches, and cemeteries were eventually built on top of them. During ordinary weather, life continued normally. But whenever the sea flooded the surrounding land, these islands of Earth remained dry. Even today, archaeologists estimate that thousands of turpen once existed across the northern Netherlands and neighboring regions. Hundreds still survive. Some are more than 2,000 years old. And remarkably, many are still inhabited. Standing on one of these ancient mounds today means standing on one of Europe's oldest examples of large-scale environmental engineering. Long before modern technology, long before concrete, long before pumps or machinery, people were already reshaping the landscape with nothing more than determination. This was the beginning of one of humanity's longest engineering projects. But eventually, simply building higher wasn't enough. The population grew. Trade expanded. Communities became wealthier. The valuable farmland surrounding the villages remained underwater for much of the year. Living above the floods was no longer enough. The Dutch wanted to control them. Around 1,000 years ago, they made a revolutionary decision. Instead of protecting individual villages, they would protect the land itself. Small earth walls gradually connected together, village by village, field by field. These became the first dikes. Unlike the Turpin, which merely escaped the floods, dikes attempted something far more ambitious. They tried to keep the sea out altogether. It was one of the most important turning points in Dutch history, because once a dike surrounded an area, everyone living behind it shared exactly the same fate. If one section collapsed, everyone flooded. It didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, a farmer or a nobleman, a merchant or a fisherman. Water treated everyone equally. And that simple reality changed Dutch society forever. Protecting the dikes required something almost unheard of in medieval Europe: cooperation. Every family depended on every other family. If just one landowner neglected their section of the dike, the entire community could lose everything. To solve this problem, local people created organizations unlike anything seen elsewhere at the time. These became known as water boards. Centuries before the Dutch state even existed, before the country had a king, before many European nations had functioning governments, the Dutch were already electing officials responsible for managing water. These institutions collected taxes, inspected dikes, settled disputes, organized repairs, and forced everyone regardless of wealth or social status to contribute. Many historians believe these water boards are among the oldest continuously operating democratic institutions anywhere in the world. Some have existed for over 700 years. Remarkably, they still exist today. Modern Dutch citizens still vote in water board elections. Alongside choosing members of parliament, they also choose the people responsible for protecting the country from floods. It might sound unusual elsewhere. In the Netherlands, water is considered just as important as politics. There was another remarkable tradition. Whenever severe storms threatened the dikes, every able-bodied resident could be called upon to help defend them. Men worked through the night carrying sandbags, reinforcing weak sections, repairing leaks, and watching for signs of collapse. Failure to respond wasn't simply irresponsible. It endangered entire communities. Even today, emergency volunteers continue this centuries-old tradition. During major storms, specialists patrol kilometers of dikes searching for even the smallest signs of weakness. Technology has changed. The responsibility has not. Many historians believe this constant struggle against water shaped something even greater than the landscape. It shaped the Dutch themselves. Centuries of cooperation encouraged negotiation rather than conflict, practical solutions instead of endless arguments, compromise instead of pride. Because against the sea, there are no winners in political debates. Either the dike holds, or everyone loses. Perhaps that's why the Netherlands became famous for consensus politics centuries before the word democracy became common. The sea demanded unity, and over generations, it became part of the nation's identity. The machines that kept a country alive building dikes was only the beginning. Keeping the sea out solved one problem, but it immediately created another. Rain continued to fall. Rivers still overflowed. Groundwater slowly seeped upward through the soft soil. Without a way to remove this water, every field protected by a dike would eventually turn into a shallow lake. The Dutch had won the battle against the sea. Now they faced a new enemy trapped inside their own defenses. If they couldn't drain the water, everything they had built would disappear. The solution would become one of the greatest symbols of the Netherlands, the windmill. Today, people associate Dutch windmills with postcards, paintings, and tourists taking photographs among colorful tulip fields. But their original purpose had almost nothing to do with grinding grain. Most of them were giant water pumps, and without them, the modern Netherlands could never have existed. The principle was surprisingly elegant. Powerful winds from the North Sea constantly swept across the flat Dutch landscape. Instead of letting that energy go to waste, engineers built large wooden windmills capable of converting wind into mechanical power. Inside each mill, massive gears transferred the rotation of the sails to enormous scoop wheels and later to Archimedes screws. These devices slowly lifted water from lower canals into higher ones. From there, the water flowed into even larger canals before finally reaching rivers or the sea. One windmill could move thousands of liters every minute. A chain of windmills could drain an entire lake. For the first time in history, humans possessed a practical method for creating new land on a massive scale. This was no longer flood protection. It was land manufacturing. The Dutch gave this reclaimed land a name: a polder. A polder is far more than simply dry land. It is a carefully engineered landscape surrounded by dikes, crossed by canals, and completely dependent on constant water management. Unlike ordinary land, a polder has no natural drainage. Rainwater cannot simply flow away. Every drop must be pumped out, forever. That is the hidden reality of life below sea level. The work is never finished. Every day, every month, every year, water must leave faster than it arrives. If the pumps stop, nature immediately begins reclaiming what humans have borrowed. Beginning in the 15th century, Dutch engineers became increasingly ambitious. Instead of draining marshes, they started draining entire lakes. The process demanded extraordinary patience. First, workers built a circular dike around the lake. Next, canals were dug around its edge. Then dozens of windmills were positioned in carefully planned stages. Because a single windmill couldn't lift water several meters at once, multiple mills worked together like a staircase. Each one raised the water slightly higher before passing it to the next. Sometimes dozens of windmills operated simultaneously for years. Only after millions of tons of water had been removed did the muddy lakebed finally emerge. Fresh soil gradually dried, roads appeared, villages followed, fields replaced open water. The Dutch were literally redrawing the map of Europe. One of the most remarkable examples was Haarlemmermeer. For centuries, this enormous lake posed a growing threat to nearby towns. Storms repeatedly enlarged it, swallowing villages and farmland. By the 19th century, many feared the lake would eventually reach Amsterdam itself. Rather than surrender, Dutch engineers launched one of the largest drainage projects ever attempted. Steam-powered pumping stations far more powerful than traditional windmills worked continuously. For nearly 4 years, more than 800 million cubic meters of water were removed. When the work finally ended, over 180 square kilometers of entirely new land had appeared. Today, few visitors realize they're standing on what was once the bottom of a dangerous inland sea. Because this reclaimed land now hosts one of Europe's busiest airports. Amsterdam Schiphol Airport sits approximately 4 meters below sea level. Its name preserves a memory of the past. Historians believe Schiphol roughly means ship grave or ship's hell, referring to the many vessels that once sank in the storms of the old lake. Every year, tens of millions of passengers arrive at an airport built where fishermen once sailed. By the 18th century, the Netherlands had become a global leader in hydraulic engineering. Foreign rulers sent delegations to study Dutch techniques. Engineers from across Europe traveled here to learn how a nation could successfully control water on such an enormous scale. Even today, Dutch universities remain among the world's leading centers for flood management and coastal engineering. Many of the experts protecting cities like New Orleans, Jakarta, Venice, Bangkok, and New York received part of their training in the Netherlands. The Dutch transformed centuries of survival into an international profession. No place better represents this era than Kinderdijk. South of Rotterdam lies one of the most recognizable landscapes on Earth. 19 historic windmills stand beside a network of canals, almost exactly as they did centuries ago. Together they formed an enormous drainage system, capable of protecting thousands of hectares of farmland. Unlike isolated windmills seen elsewhere in Europe, these mills functioned as one carefully coordinated machine. Each depended on the others. If one failed, the entire system became less effective. Today, Kinderdijk is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Millions visit every year, but what tourists admire as beautiful scenery was originally a matter of survival. Every spinning sail represented another day the sea had been kept at bay. Of course, wind alone was never perfectly reliable. Some years brought long periods of calm weather. When the wind stopped, so did the pumps. As technology advanced, steam engines gradually replaced many windmills during the 19th century. Later came diesel engines, then electric pumps. Modern pumping stations dwarf anything the old millers could have imagined. Some can move millions of liters of water every minute. Thousands of pumping stations now operate across the Netherlands 24 hours a day. Many function automatically, constantly measuring rainfall, river levels, groundwater pressure, and tidal conditions. Sophisticated computer systems decide exactly when water should be moved and where it should go. The country has effectively become one giant machine, invisible to most visitors, but always working. Yet every victory created a new problem. The soil beneath much of the Netherlands contains enormous amounts of peat. When peat remains underwater, it stays relatively stable. But once drained, it begins to dry. As it dries, it shrinks. The land slowly sinks. This process, known as subsidence, has continued for centuries. Ironically, every successful drainage project caused the land to become even lower. The lower the land became, the more pumping was required. The more pumping occurred, the more the ground continued to sink. It was a cycle with no permanent solution. The Dutch had trapped themselves in an endless engineering challenge. Stopping was impossible. Continuing meant working forever. By the 17th century, another Dutch innovation quietly spread far beyond the country's borders. Surveyors established an official reference point for measuring elevation. Known as the Amsterdam Ordnance Datum, it represented the average water level near Amsterdam. Over time, neighboring countries adopted similar reference systems based upon it. Today, many elevations in parts of Europe are still connected, directly or indirectly, to measurements first established in the Netherlands. In a sense, a small country below sea level ended up defining how much of Europe measures sea level itself. The Dutch often joke that they don't actually own their country. They're simply renting it from the sea, and like any rental agreement, the payments never stop. Every day requires maintenance. Every generation repairs what the previous one built. Every storm serves as a reminder that nature is always waiting for a mistake. For centuries, the system worked, floods still happened, but nothing on a truly catastrophic scale. Many people began believing they had finally mastered the sea. History was about to prove otherwise. The sea had not surrendered. It had only been waiting. The night the sea returned for centuries, the Dutch had held the line. Generation after generation strengthened the dikes, drained new land, and expanded the country's defenses. The Netherlands became richer, more densely populated, and increasingly confident in its ability to control water. But nature has a way of reminding humanity who truly makes the rules. On the night of February 1, 1953, the sea struck back. It remains one of the darkest nights in Dutch history. The disaster did not begin with a single giant wave. Instead, it was the result of several unfortunate events occurring at exactly the wrong moment. A powerful North Atlantic storm was moving toward northwestern Europe. Hurricane-force winds swept across the North Sea, pushing enormous volumes of water toward the Dutch coast. At the same time, an unusually high spring tide was approaching. Either event alone would have been dangerous. Together, they became catastrophic. The North Sea acted like a giant funnel. As millions of tons of seawater were driven southward, there was nowhere for it to go except against the coast of the Netherlands. Hour after hour, the water continued to rise. Meteorologists had issued warnings, but this was 1953. Weather forecasting was still in its infancy. Communication systems were limited. Many local officials never received the full warning in time. Most families simply went to bed. They had no idea that the sea was already climbing toward their homes. Just after midnight, the first dikes began to fail, not all at once. One breach, then another, then dozens. Ancient earthworks, weakened by years of insufficient maintenance after the Second World War, simply could not withstand the enormous pressure. Once a single section collapsed, millions of cubic meters of seawater rushed through the opening with incredible force. Entire villages disappeared beneath black water within minutes. People woke to an impossible sight. Ice-cold seawater pouring through their front doors. Windows exploding inward. Furniture floating across living rooms. Children crying in darkness. Animals breaking free from their barns. Families scrambled upstairs carrying blankets, candles, and whatever food they could grab. Some climbed onto rooftops. Others clung to trees. Many never had the chance. Unlike modern disasters, there was almost no way to coordinate rescue efforts. Telephone lines had been torn down. Roads vanished beneath the flood. Radio stations stopped broadcasting overnight. Entire communities became isolated islands surrounded by freezing water. Nobody knew how widespread the catastrophe had become. Some villages believed they were the only place affected. Others waited hours before realizing no help was coming. One unexpected group became crucial: amateur radio operators. Using homemade transmitters powered by batteries and generators, volunteers worked continuously throughout the night, relaying desperate messages between isolated communities and emergency services. Without them, many rescue missions might never have happened. As dawn finally broke, the scale of the disaster became visible. What had been farmland only hours earlier had become an inland sea. Church steeples emerged like lonely islands. Only the rooftops of houses remained visible above the water. Dead livestock floated for kilometers. Wooden fences, wagons, furniture, and entire buildings drifted through flooded villages. The landscape had become almost unrecognizable. Some survivors spent more than 24 hours stranded on rooftops. in freezing winter temperatures. Others drifted away on pieces of debris, hoping someone would find them. Many families were separated forever. Rescuing the survivors proved incredibly difficult. The Netherlands simply did not possess enough helicopters. Military amphibious vehicles were few in number. Rescue boats struggled against powerful currents and floating wreckage. So ordinary people stepped forward. Local fishermen launched their own boats into the floodwaters. Ignoring the danger, they navigated through submerged streets, pulling families from rooftops and attic windows. Many worked without rest for days. Soldiers, police officers, volunteers, farmers, and even civilians from neighboring countries joined the rescue effort. International assistance quickly arrived from Britain, Belgium, France, the United States, and many other nations. Aircraft dropped food. Ships carried emergency supplies. Medical teams treated thousands of survivors. The world had come to help a country drowning. When the floodwaters finally receded, the numbers were heartbreaking. More than 1,800 people had lost their lives. Over 70,000 people were forced to evacuate. Around 200,000 hectares of farmland lay underwater. Tens of thousands of cattle, horses, and sheep had drowned. Entire villages had effectively ceased to exist. For a country of fewer than 11 million people at the time, the disaster was comparable to losing an entire city. Many survivors would later describe it as feeling less like a natural disaster and more like war. Yet amid the tragedy, stories of extraordinary courage emerged. One of the most remarkable actually happened during the flood itself. Unlike the famous tale of the little boy plugging a leak with his finger, this story was completely real. Near one critical breach, seawater poured through a broken dike with such force that nearby cities faced the threat of catastrophic flooding. Engineers knew they had only hours, perhaps less. Someone proposed an almost impossible solution. A local barge captain was asked to sacrifice his own vessel. Without hesitation, he agreed. The captain steered his aging barge directly toward the breach. Battling violent currents, he aimed the heavy vessel into the opening. The impact wedged the ship firmly across the gap. It didn't seal the breach completely, but it slowed the flood just enough. Workers immediately rushed forward with sandbags, rocks, and heavy equipment. Hour by hour, they reinforced the damaged dike. Without that single barge, millions more people might have been endangered. Sometimes history changes because one ordinary person decides to act. The flood left deep scars across Dutch society. Many survivors refused to return to their homes. Children who lived through that night spoke decades later about nightmares involving rising water. Entire communities held annual memorials. 4 years afterward, whenever storms approached the North Sea, anxiety spread across the country. People remembered. The sea had shown them that even 1,000 years of engineering could fail. Only weeks after the disaster, the Dutch government reached a conclusion. There could be no temporary solution, no simple repairs, no political delays. The country would either build stronger defenses or one day face another catastrophe. A national commission began studying every weakness in the coastal protection system. Its recommendation would become one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history, a project so enormous that it would change not only the geography of the Netherlands, but the future of flood protection around the entire world. It would become known simply as the Delta Works.